Greetings and welcome. My name is Adam Neiman. I'm the artistic director of the Manchester Music Festival, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to this spotlight interview with Ignat Solzhenitsyn. Ignat, welcome.
So good to be with you, Adam.
So good to have you with us, and so good to see your healthy face during these crazy times. I'm assuming everything's been canceled for you and there's no travel. I hope your family and your loved ones are all safe and sound.
Thank you, Adam. Everybody's well and just kind of riding this thing out, as is the case for, I'm sure for you and for our colleagues and for millions and even billions of people around the planet. It's such strange, as you say, unsettling times. I think for us as performers, it's so odd not to have that opportunity and that privilege and that pressure to be on stage and to be sharing the music that touches us the most, constantly bringing it before the public and successfully, less successfully, and learning and continuing, and that's such an essential part of our life that how odd to have it suspended as far as the eye can see, with not even that clear sense of, yes, but it will start up again on such and such a date. For me, that doesn't seem clear at all. So,
yeah.
Strange
Times indeed. Our audience should know that besides being an amazing conductor, which is the capacity in which the MMF audience has thus far witnessed your art form, Ignat is an incredibly broad musician who's a solo pianist, chamber musician, concerto soloist, conductor, as you know, and a pedagogue. And this theme of broadness and sort of entrepreneurship is something very contemporary, and I would love for our audience to kind of pick your brain and get to know why and how that was your path, that you forged that path in life with so many facets to the way that you live and create art. So I was thinking maybe we could start with the beginning. Perhaps you could take us back in your life to how you grew up, how you trained as a musician, and how these different avenues presented themselves.
What a wonderful question, Adam. And actually, as you were asking the question, I was thinking, that's not so easy for me to answer. Not so obvious to kind of analyze it. But when you brought it back to my beginnings, actually, that makes every sense to start there. I'm just thinking now, because the beginning of my life, the beginning of my conscious life, is maybe a little bit unusual for a musician in that music itself was not the dominant feature in the life of my household, of my parents' household, because they weren't musicians. And as you know, for most of us, our parents are musicians, or at least one parent is a musician, and that seems to be how it goes. But my parents loved music, but of course, and I grew up with, first of all, that a wondrously kind of broad viewpoint available to me on all kinds of matters in the world of art and in the world of culture and perhaps beyond it. So that was the first stroke of luck, I think.
Yeah.
Then when I began to show an interest and a talent for music, I received somewhat haphazard training, meaning my first teacher wasn't actually a pianist, was somebody who just knew how to read treble and bass clef. And so he taught me to read treble and bass clef, but that literally I was on my own. And so then I would just read through the scores that had been left in the house that we bought with the old piano and the old kind of different level scores that were, etudes. Of course, I couldn't even, read, and then there were just simple, Tchaikovsky waltzes and little pieces like that. So the funny thing is that as I progressed somewhat at random at first, before I had real training, I was just as interested in the scores I found of orchestra, of symphonies and of operas. And even though I couldn't read many of the clefs, I wasn't, I didn't know how to read a fourth and G and so forth. But little by little, I figured all that out. So I guess it starts there.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I get proper training and wonderful teaching, and I, as a pianist, and I begin to, as anybody else might, kind of make my way in that as a pianist.
Yes.
But the conducting, the symphonic repertoire is something that's always there, very much close to me. For example, I'm sure that take my favorite composer, and maybe a favorite composer for many of us, and then I know how close he is for you, Beethoven.
Mm-hmm.
That was also that you're focusing on this year for the anniversary. I knew the 9 symphonies much better and much more detailed than I did the 32 Sonata.
Interesting.
At a certain point.
Wow.
Now, of course, you could say that there's fewer of them, and again, there's perhaps more detail to learn.
Yes.
Anyway, so that's so as I look back, that was kind of ecumenical in that sense, because I had these scores available, and it really what set the pattern for me was this notion that the means are somewhat secondary to the end. And I've always felt that way from an early age, and I think I still feel that way. That to take Beethoven again as an example, in the end, Beethoven uses the sonata, the symphony, the quartet, the oratorio as a means to an end. Not that he doesn't excel in the craftsmanship of writing, and we know he does, for that medium. But in the end, we can freely compare slow movement of a 9th symphony with a cantilena from Opus 130, or with the arietta of Opus 111, to go across the medium, and not feel like, oh, that's a completely different. Oh, why? It's coming from the same person.
Right.
It's coming from this human soul, and I guess that what I continue to think today. That's what matters.
When you're making music across these genres, do you take a different approach to the actual musical interpretation, or because music is music, you don't really make divisions between standing on the podium and leading 80 people or being at a piano by yourself on a stage? Do you sense that difference in the moment of actual performance? Of course, I understand that the preparation is different, but in the performance, is there a vast sensational difference to you?
Not really. In conducting a symphony, there is, of course, more responsibility to be clear, no matter where the interpretation goes. Hopefully it goes right where Beethoven wants it to go, but that's another conversation. But it has to be clear, and it has to be, to use a word we think of as a bad word in music, it has to be somewhat predictable. Because no musician that I've met wants, orchestral musician, wants to arrive at a concert, even the conductor's never seen before in the previous round.
Right.
There has to be a large degree of predictability. That's why, as you well know, that's why it'll come up in rehearsal. Oh, is that in 2 or 4?
Right.
Well, so that they know what to expect. That kind of elementary example. So that they know this will be in 2, and then it will be, or it's hopefully clear from the gesture.
Right.
But don't show up at a concert and change your pattern. And of course, in more subtle things, the kind of rubato that we might do at the piano, or even in chamber music,
yes,
it has to be applied with caution, with a certain degree of caution, in conducting an orchestra, so that the expression "your results may vary," so they don't vary too much, at the moment of truth.
Yeah, and just to clarify for some of our audience who may not be familiar with that term, rubato comes from the Italian rubare, to steal, and it refers to how musicians treat time, right? So it's the ebb and flow of a phrase, just like speech or poetry or singing, that nothing is well, some things are exactly metered, but they're specifically metered exactly for a reason. But usually, every mode of expression has a sort of flexibility to it. So as musicians, we're constantly grappling with how to make the pacing of what we do feel really idiomatic and natural and organic and in a way imperceptible. So the audience doesn't even know that we're stealing or giving back time. It just sounds like we phrase beautifully, right? So that's what Ignat is referring to, which is so interesting. And I wanted to ask you your opinion because, you know, I've listened to so many recordings, particularly older recordings. I'm a big fan of records from, you know, the 1910s, 20s, 30s, that era. And many of the orchestral recordings from that period come across so differently from modern recordings. Not just the sound difference, of course, the quality of the recording is a factor, but in particular the pacing. And for example, Sergei Rachmaninoff over here, this guy, his recordings, he has a few recordings of him conducting besides his wonderful piano recordings. And in particular, I'm thinking of his Isle of the Dead or his Third Symphony. There's a certain flexibility to his way of conducting an orchestra that strikes me as quite extraordinary. I would imagine that getting a modern orchestra to respond in that way now would be very difficult. Do you sense, because you are someone who culturally has a very strong bridge to especially the Russian past, do you sense a difference in the general aesthetic today, in the way we make music from the way music was made 100 years ago?
It's a fascinating question, Adam, and a necessary question for us to grapple with if we want to forge forward, ultimately, and make our own way as a community of individual artists. Very important question. And what I'm beginning to learn, and what's beginning to come into focus for me, is that, of course, the past is not a homogenized block that was, past, present, and future. Well, the future is unknowable, the present concrete, at least for each person. But the past is many, many, many strands, many people, many epochs, and so forth, obviously. But if we think about it, so as it applies to this question, what seems to emerge for me in my studies and my research and my listening to recordings and reading books, old books, new books, letters, is that so much was changing right around the last 20 years of the 19th century. Which now admittedly is a little more than 100 years ago. But so now let's say 140 years. And this kind of hyper freedom of pacing and of interpretation and of a kind of, let's say, dynamic extremes, or what we would think of today as extremes of vibrato in the string sound. These are things largely that, and this is of course speculative, that seem to have come in different countries of Europe at around, let's say, 1880. Still during Brahms's lifetime. And Brahms, of course, lived from 1833 to 1897. And so we see in the last 15 or so years of Brahms's life, a time when he was unquestionably at his peak of renown, at his peak of influence. He was not so old, but certainly the preeminent maestro, the preeminent composer of his time, certainly in Central Europe.
Yes.
And we see Brahms struggling with the kinds of interpretations of the music that are starting to happen. And actually, in the case of Brahms, it even goes back to Joachim, his great friend, the great violinist. Yes. And Joachim is premiering his violin concerto. And at that time, this is still another decade or 15 years earlier, and Joachim, and Brahms writes to him, and he says, I loved attending the rehearsal in Meiningen or wherever it was last week. You played with inspiration, et cetera, as always, dear friend, da, 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 da. However, why do you now play my portato so short? Portato, again, for the less knowledgeable those who are watching music, portato is a certain kind of articulation where it's, well, how long is it? It's in between long and short.
Right.
But it always was long. And Brahms makes that point to the organ. He says, why are you playing so short? For me, actually, the portato means the same as it did for my forefathers, for Haydn and for Mozart and for Beethoven and for Schubert and for Mendelssohn. It's a long stroke, so don't play short.
Interesting.
And then we have Brahms complaining about the kinds of liberties that people took in his chamber music. Yeah. We also have evidence from Brahms saying how important breathing is and how important. So we know that too, and we have eyewitness accounts of Brahms changing the tempo. So this is not to say, but it's just to say that it seems to be changing very much in terms of string sound and string aesthetic between 1880 and, let's say, 1910 and 1920.
Right.
By the time that recorded sound, and you know much more about this than I do because you're such a great aficionado of these old recordings, and the great artists who populate them, who give them life. But in that time, in the 1910s and really 20s, I guess, and certainly into the 30s, by then the kind of playing we're hearing, especially from string players, but I think from conductors and from pianists, is not necessarily a breath from, let's say, Beethoven's time. The tradition is still alive, or even from Brahms's time. It's more the new tradition. And again, I'm obviously more than open to have my mind changed, but that's what I'm understanding. That's the new tradition of the 1880s and 90s that we're hearing as applied to Brahms or Bach or whoever, as opposed to this is the way that Beethoven would have heard it, or even Brahms. So that, I think, if that's true, or to the extent that's true, maybe informs us how we can forge our paths in interpretation today.
That's really interesting. And I think to add to that, perhaps there's a sense now of historical information that's available to us as musicians that the typical musician of, say, 1920 would not have, not so easily. Just the fact that we can Google anything, Wikipedia anything, grab a book on a treatise from the Baroque era to learn about exact ornamentation. Those kinds of resources were, in some cases, just being discovered in the 1920s. Those primary sources, things were still being written in the musicological field to kind of tell us about what traditions existed. So yes, perhaps the change in performance style really correlates to a gathering of information about what is closer to the performance practice of the composers. It's also interesting that time, the 1920s, 30s, 40s, so many charismatic artists really, as you say, populate the recorded canon, and perhaps that has something to do with the way performance got stretched and pulled. I think of Horowitz as an example. I was mentioning this to a friend the other day, that he recorded the third Rachmaninoff concerto, I think 3 times. But the first of those recordings took place when Rachmaninoff was still alive. And actually, it's my favorite of his 3. It's also the most faithful to the text of what Rachmaninoff actually wrote. What's interesting to me is once Rachmaninoff was gone, and Horowitz was pretty much the preeminent virtuoso of the middle to late 20th century, he became more, we could say, indulgent, or personalized, or just idiosyncratic, where he felt certain things and he felt that it was okay to just deviate from what's written in the score. I think it's interesting for our audience to think about that when they're listening to a performance, because in many cases I think our audience takes the performance as a kind of gospel sometimes, that if it was good and they enjoyed it, it must be correct in terms of what the composer meant, but actually we have no way of knowing that. It's all a guessing game in a way, right?
I mean, what a great point. It's true that perhaps a music lover who's not necessarily educated or a musician himself and just loves to listen. Had sometimes how is he to, or she to know whether it is a gospel truth or whether it's sort of the flip coin and a kind of a satanic temptation, which could be kind of equally appealing.
Yeah,
it's fascinating you mentioned Horowitz because I'm thinking of I guess it's 1978. You know these recordings better than I do, and I think 1978 is his last recording of the third concerto.
Yeah,
and I think it's a live recording.
Yeah,
and it seems really quite far, as compelling as it is in some ways, but it seems quite far from what's written in the score and from what one thinks Rachmaninoff might have done. But until the end of his life, he retained that the sheen, the kind of patina, the hallmark of authenticity that came with, he knew Rachmaninoff and played for Rachmaninoff. And of course, that's beguiling and what an honor. But as you know, Rachmaninoff didn't necessarily approve of everything Horowitz did. And there was a tension in their creative partnership.
Yeah.
And I don't think Rachmaninoff felt, from what I understand, that Horowitz played the third concerto even better than Rachmaninoff could himself. That there's that. I don't believe it. And anyway, that's not to disparage Horowitz in any way. He was an absolute wizard.
Of course.
But just, it's not clear. Then the other thing about that you mentioned the freedom, and one thing I noticed with Rachmaninoff in particular, and particularly with the Rachmaninoff conductor, of just a handful of recordings, as you mentioned, is I noticed this startling combination of kind of inner freedom, by which I also mean freedom between the beats.
Yes.
The very subtle kind of, with an overwhelmingly convincing sense of pulse.
Yes.
And that is something that combination is something we can really profit from if we can raise it up to fruition in our own selves.
Yes.
Because tends to be that art are either by the book and frankly boring,
right,
or pedantic, and they even get a certain reputation that it's very faithful. But what does that mean? It can be dead. Right. And then you have the self-indulgent kind of I do what I want.
Right.
And that's a very popular with audiences as well, but clearly something to stay away from.
Well, it's contingent on the charisma of the performer, right? If the performer can carry it off, then. But we look at words by even Chopin going back, to the 19th century, and he's talking about rubato as like the trunk of a tree. So that the rhythm is the trunk of the tree, and the rubato are the branches swaying in the breeze, but they're always connected to that trunk. And as you say, Brahms was in some ways disturbed by some of the pushing and pulling of the pulse of his music, and I've read some of those accounts too. So it seems that composers themselves probably grapple with performance tradition, not sure how to bring out the best in their music. I'm curious about when you are actually working with young musicians in an orchestra. So let's say either a training orchestra or young artist orchestra, like where at MMF we have young artists integrated with seasoned professionals. Do you talk a lot to the orchestra? Do you leave everything for the baton to do the talking for you? What is your philosophy of educating as you are working?
Great question. While nobody likes a conductor who talks too much, that's a bane of orchestral life. I think if you and I know that. Making some rehearsal this morning, this guy's going to talk for longer than we play. Nobody likes that because it has to be in the doing and it has to be the communal doing together. Having said that, with a training orchestra, with a young orchestra, with that kind of wonderful blend, the blend you have with the youngsters or younger, beautiful players and quite experienced players already in the
Yes.
and then the more seasoned, wonderful professionals. But one does sense an opportunity, frankly, a duty to say a little more, and maybe not to leave unsaid things that professionals already know.
Yes.
Professionals forget too, but it's an opportunity to say, to speak up for certain values that, as the defender of the composer, I feel I ought to transmit. I steal that expression from Erich Leinsdorf. Not necessarily one of my favorite conductors, because he was rather dry and sort of not my favorite conductor, but a wonderful thinker about music and a distinguished figure. But I love that idea, the defender of the composer. Who will defend the composer if the conductor does? Now, you can extrapolate, and obviously in a solo piano recital, obviously it's the solo pianist who has to defend the composer from himself.
True.
But someone has to stand up. Someone has to stand up, and again, we say this with a grain of salt, because none of us knows. But we, as best we can, divine that truth and divine what the piece is about and what the style is about. Don't forget that, and I know you don't, but again, for our listeners and viewers, that the crucial, the importance of style in bringing a cohesive performance.
Yes.
And when particularly in orchestral, well, chamber music does the same, but it's even more obvious in orchestra playing, when we experience an orchestral concert that seems cohesive, that seems the orchestra played as one, everyone breathes together, all of those things. So much of that is not just actual ensemble, meaning played together, but it's playing with a shared sense of style, which means how long notes are, which means how much vibrato we use in the strings, which means even how much vibrato we use in the winds, which is more personal, and so many, how we pedal, if it's the pianist, so important. So all of that comes into it, and the point is that for a conductor with a young orchestra, there can be opportunities to correct something that is clearly off kilter in terms of style in particular.
Yes.
And then maybe that point. And so, for example, I not infrequently can make reference to that letter of Brahms. Well, it's a famous letter, and people can know about it without my good office. But I have occasion to mention that, because there you have black and white, the composer saying, look, I know my style, I know what it is, that's not it. And that can be educational. I know it's educational for me.
Absolutely. Well, I can tell you from having spoken to our young artists how much they appreciate that, because, like you said, they are already in some ways seasoned and experienced, but their orchestral experience has generally been limited to school orchestra, usually with one or two conductors, maybe a guest here and there, but they've had relatively little exposure to a wide variety of conducting styles. So having someone like you who's so worldly, who's so cultured and so deeply experienced to come in, even for that short period of time, 4 or 5 days, whatever it is, and give them these tidbits, I know they appreciate it, because they all felt that they learned from that experience. And so I thank you for, not only being willing to conduct for us, but being willing to be an educator for us too.
My sense is that they are willing to learn. That they are willing to, that they are there for that reason.
Yes.
To be open to new experience, new ideas, and to do what all of us should be doing, which is to learn and improve and question, and then assert with confidence, and then question again, and let that cycle repeat. To have talent and to have that desire to serve something greater than oneself. That's what one hopes to see, and that one tries to foster.
Yeah, that confidence and humility dichotomy there is something you must, in a way, confront all the time. being a conductor as well as a pianist, you're constantly in a position of, and I'll put this in air quotes, power, that you're the ultimate arbiter, you're the one leading the band, so to speak. How do you internally balance between having the confidence to assert your point of view, to make sure that time runs and you get done what needs doing, which requires a certain amount of confidence and leadership, at the same time as remaining open and wondrous at the magic of what's actually happening? I know for myself that's a constant preoccupation. How do you deal with that? How do you internalize that process?
It's a constant push and pull. And it's the question, I think, of prioritizing or perhaps pausing time. So that let's say in preparation for performance, up until the last minute, that there can and should be change of mind and some kind of a tweak. That maybe the tempo is a little too slow. Mm-hmm. Maybe the sound is a little too rich, or whatever. And questioning and just experimenting, trying a different fingering. Mm-hmm. In the case of the piano or violin. In the case of a conductor, it could even be something technical too. Mm-hmm. Perhaps changing from 4 to 2 or from 3 to 1, mm-hmm. or vice versa. Again, talking about pattern that the musicians see. So I think we have to not be afraid of that. I mean, you and I both have colleagues who will say, yeah, you're right, that's a better fingering, but I can't change it now. And I'll say, why? I'm performing in 6 weeks. I'll say, what? That's a certain rigidity, and you and I know where that's coming from. But if you're that inflexible,
yeah,
that's good. I think you have maybe not the day of, maybe not the day before, but I guess we're all but just to say that. But then there has to be confidence when we're performing that we absolutely believe in what we're doing,
right?
And of course, there has to be a freedom at the same time that cannot manifest itself if we are too nervous, mm-hmm. if we are too afraid, mm-hmm. if we are just trying to survive. Mm-hmm. Trying to get through, and sometimes that can happen.
Yeah.
And right, if we're not prepared enough, if we're not really mature, if the piece hasn't matured enough in us,
yeah,
or if we have time to practice or whatever, and some performance can be adequate enough, and again, maybe even get a very good response from let's say from the audience, but we know it's not as that it doesn't have the necessary inner space. Yeah. Inner freedom.
Yeah, I think one of the most important things we can do on stage, and one of the hardest things to do, is to take time, to let things breathe, because so our audience understands, and I'm sure they suspect, time does not run for us on stage the same way it does for those listening. I mean, of course, the objective time runs the same for all of us, but the perception of time is so different, and things occur on a much faster time scale, I think, in our mental processes. So being able to actually let a rest where there's no sound exist for like 3.5 seconds can feel like 40 seconds to the performer. It feels almost like an exaggeration, and then you listen back to the recording and you say, yeah, that's the right amount of time. And the ability to just let time unfold in an organic way is extremely challenging. Do you find the same perception of time, Ignat?
Very much the same. It's almost how beautifully you communicated that, and how difficult to describe that to a layperson. Describe that to someone who maybe, again, knows music but doesn't play music, or at least does not play in public.
Right.
That's a mystery.
Yeah.
What happens on stage? and how time's stretched. It must be something along, something of akin to these great mysteries of science and the great questions of Einstein. Something about the black holes.
Mm-hmm.
Something where we know that we know enough now to know that the laws of Newtonian physics do get bent,
mm-hmm.
do get, if not outright canceled or reversed.
Right.
Certain situations that we can only perceive for now, but we are beginning to contour in our own minds and in our research as a species.
Yeah.
Something that must be, you and I and other performers already know intuitively from our experience on stage.
Yeah.
Because it's so unlike normal time. I wanted to say one of my favorite experiences of that in recent years has been our collaboration on the Rachmaninoff First Concerto.
Oh.
Speaking of Rachmaninoff. And what I remember, that was at MMF in
2019. Last year?
2000.
Yeah.
Last year. It was a long time. What I remember the most, I mean, from that is just the ease with which you manage this frightfully difficult and fluid concerto. But then that freedom of breathing and of little rubato that you brought to bear really throughout the piece, in the slow movement, in the E flat episode, in the last movement, and it just made the actual making of the music at the time, the music making together, so fresh and so good, without losing the big picture, and then everything falls apart. So it just makes me think of it. It makes me think how important that is, and yet to do it in good measure, in good taste. And that really was a wonderful highlight for me. Well, and that's the best approach.
Thank you.
And somehow you exemplified it.
Well, we did it together, but thank you. That really means a lot coming from you, Ignat.
But let me reverse the tables and let me ask you. I'm curious about the opposite side of that same coin. What about performances where, for whatever reason, because of extreme familiarity with the repertoire, because of some kind of external circumstances, maybe the hall is only half full, mm-hmm. and there isn't that electricity, whatever the case may be, maybe something going on in your life, but you come on stage and you have no sense of feast, mm-hmm. and no sense of sacrament, mm-hmm. And really just, it feels absolutely ho-hum. That happened, and then what do you draw on to presumably rectify or try to rectify that and still screw yourself up for a great performance, or at least a decent performance?
That's it. Yeah, that's an interesting topic. I mean, I can't claim to have the answer, but I would say that what I've been fortunate with is a genuine love for music. Above all other things, that above my life, the value of my life, or the particular circumstances of my life at a given point, one thing that has never changed from the first moment I heard sound was that I adore music with my entire being. And there's almost no composer whose music I don't appreciate. I simply stand in awe and love with music as a field. So for me, that is the well from which I dip in those moments where an external circumstance or my fatigue or a fever or whatever it might be is trying to get in my way of being present and spontaneous and enjoying the moment. I also, and this maybe is more controversial, but I would say that I view my role as a kind of soldier too. I think I have a job to do, and like a soldier, my job is not dependent on whether I enjoy it. So if I'm having a bad day on stage, that's not the audience's concern. It should not be the audience's concern. So I have an obligation, I think, to put myself aside and instead do my best to be a channel for the music. And at the very least, I can hope that I produce something that gives other people some pleasure and inspiration, even if I didn't partake on that particular date. But I do view it as a kind of professional obligation.
That's inspiring, Adam, and it's and I love what you're saying, and I love that sense of, well, when you say soldier, of course, it makes me think of Shostakovich.
Yeah.
And Shostakovich tells, I think it's Volkov in Testimony, where he says, in music there are no generals. We're all soldiers of music. I'm a soldier of music. And what an incredible thing to hear from truly one of the great generals. But for him to say that with apparent sincerity. But I wish I would like to hear from an experience from our colleagues today and maybe across the centuries, a little more sense of an artist's duty and obligation, and less of endless, I shouldn't say claptrap, but maybe I will anyway, about inspiration and the spirit movement.
Right.
Because of course that's vital.
Yes.
And we all want carried on the wings of the spirit.
Yes.
That's not enough. And it's not enough for the great composers. And we see that in their craftsmanship. We see that in their education. We see that in Schubert taking counterpoint lessons as the dead man, so to speak, knowing he's dying 4 weeks for his death.
Yeah.
He wants to prove.
Yeah.
We see that. It's not just, I know I'm I need to become a more complete person. So that's inspiring.
I mean, I always view, I don't know how you view this, Ignat. I don't view a performance as a final product. I mean, if I don't like it, I can toss my own performance. I don't feel an innate reverence for everything I do just because I did it. I'm perfectly happy to just toss and start over, but I figure it's better to just be doing it constantly and trying and not waiting for the muses to speak to my ear.
Well, Adam, and then of course I don't compose, but you do.
Yes.
And I can't imagine juggling what you juggle with all the aspects of your life as a performer, and as a composer and a pedagogue, and running the festival and running your department and everything. But how do you approach that? Is the discipline of sitting down to compose when maybe you're not inspired or feel like it at that moment? Do you try to set? Are you able to set a schedule? Does that help? Is that necessary?
So I have the luxury of considering myself a part-time composer in a way. I purposefully don't really take commissions often, and I write what I want to write, basically when I want to write it, because as you mentioned, I have these other things which are really my primary professional life, and I view my composition as an incredibly important thing for me personally. I have no pretensions about its importance to anyone else, but it's very important to me just as part of a creative loop, and so when I'm inspired by an idea or intrigued or just feel like it, I will then do nothing but write, basically. If I'm juggling obligations, like I'm in the middle of the festival and I've got to play a concert and this and that, and I'm composing a piece, then yes, I will make sure that every day I touch that piece. And I have found that, contrary to my suspicions, I actually can write good music when I'm not in a musical mood. And sometimes that objectivity is helpful, because sometimes when we're hyper emotional, we enjoy sitting there and indulging in the sounds we produce, but it's not actually good music. And sometimes it's better music when we approach it more from a third-party standpoint. So for me, there are times when I'm very disciplined about composition, but just going back to that part-time composer thing, it's a luxury that I hold on to, because I don't want to become a composer who is constantly writing stuff maybe that he doesn't believe in. I want to always stand behind my pieces as something that I truly love as one of my children. And so that's a particular indulgence I get to enjoy because of the nature of my career.
That's great. What a real credo that you can hang on to. Please do.
I will. Ignat, I wanted to ask you, and I know that our audience is aware that you have connections to southern Vermont, and you have a home, I believe, in the area. So how did that connection to Vermont take place?
It was really quite haphazard by chance, because my family was, as many viewers may know, was expelled from the USSR, from Russia, and we were first found refuge in Switzerland, in Zurich. Mm. But after a short time in Zurich, it became apparent that my father would not be able to have the kind of quiet and really seclusion that he needed for his work as a writer, and in particular to tackle his magnum opus, The Red Wheel, the history of the Russian Revolution. And so he thought, and my mother thought, that we should move to North America, and originally the thought was Canada, mm-hmm. for reasons that, beyond our canon today, or beyond the scope of our discussion, but somewhere in North America, but preferably with 4 seasons, mm-hmm. with snow, so it wouldn't have been Florida or Arizona, but somewhere that's somewhat like Russia in terms of climate, and somewhere quiet. Mm-hmm. And in short, they started looking, and this place came available in Vermont, the old kind of a farmstead that the owner had died, and widow was as is, and getting rid of it. And it had old furniture. By the way, it had a baby grand piano, which is
wow.
Coming back to the beginning of entry, how I really played. But in short, that's how. And they bought it sight unseen.
Wow.
Except for photographs that were sent by Federal Express or whatever service, and they looked at the photos and they said, okay, that sounds right, looks right, and they made the purchase, and then it served as an extraordinary refuge for fathers throughout his 18 years in America before his return and my mother's return home to Russia, mm-hmm. and it served as the place where they raised their family.
Wow.
So that's the kind of connection to Vermont that our whole family felt a great gratitude and love for.
Well, Vermont is a very special place. The air is so clean, and as you say, it's so quiet and beautiful and crystalline. I always marvel when I fly into Vermont, and I usually fly into Albany, New York, because it's the convenient airport. I mean, it's beautiful in upstate New York, absolutely beautiful in that region, but the moment I cross the border into Vermont, the roads get smoother, the vistas get wider. It's really quite extraordinary. What a beautiful place to grow up in.
It is a beautiful place to grow up in. A kind of a land blessed by God,
yeah,
and which every land is, but something about Vermont, something about the kind of unpretentious character of the people, mm-hmm. first and foremost, but then also of the landscape.
Yeah.
Because you and I travel a great deal, and you know that there are many, many more spectacular places in the world, and in the United States. I mean, for example, the Rockies. The Appalachians are as nothing compared to the Rockies. So much bigger, so much more spectacular,
right?
Majestic, and yet the true beauty that is in the kind of those gentle hills of in southwestern Vermont,
yeah.
in particular, is something every bit as magnificent. The combination of making music in Vermont too is something that really harkens back, I think, to Schubert and to Beethoven, yeah. and to composers who to that whole German tradition, actually, and Russian, but German especially, communing with nature and of being amongst nature, in nature, and that music is nature, and then Wagner and building on that. But somehow for me, that's always because I spent so much time in Vermont and going, as to summer camp, and then of course my kind of lifelong association with Marlborough.
Yeah.
And so much of particularly of chamber music making for me is tied up with Vermont, and tied up with the smells and the sounds of evening Vermont summer, and the birds and the crickets and the mosquitoes and everything that goes with it. And it's quite marvelous. And so and I sensed that at MMF, and that's one of the things I've enjoyed so much, is kind of reconnecting with that feeling.
Oh, it's so idyllic there. It's so wonderful. Yeah, I've heard that smell is the most powerful sense in terms of its relation to memory. And I feel the same way. When I think of certain pieces of music, I can smell where I was when I first heard it. I mean, that sounds really weird, but yeah, it's amazing. You play one of the most beautiful movements from one of the most beautiful piano sonatas by Beethoven, speaking of calm and idyllic and philosophical. So just tell us a little bit about this piece, and then we'll hear your performance.
This is the Grand Sonata, Opus 7, in E-flat major, the very end of the 18th century, the peak of Beethoven's public activities as a performer in Vienna. And in this sonata, he declares that he will go beyond even the stunning achievements of his three sonatas, Opus 2 of the three trios, Opus 1. He will go further now and write a grand sonata, a sonata that in ambition and its scope will supersede everything that's come before, and it does. And then the second movement, which I will play for you now, the Largo, which for me is really one of the summits of Beethoven's art.
Well, let's hear it, Ignat. Ignat, thank you. What a beautiful performance of that Beethoven. So amazing. So thank you for your time. Thank you for playing for us. Thank you for being part of the MMF family. We truly love having you. And I know our audience has been greatly enriched by getting to hear your thoughts about many things. So thank you.
Adam, love talking to you. Love your festival. Love your audience. Love that you're doing this and continuing kind of full bore in impossible circumstances. So happy to be part of it, and good luck the rest of the way. And I hope to see you soon.
You too, Ignat. Thank you.